So in this video we're going to cover some pivot points and also freeze and transforms and why it's important. I'm going to cover what a pivot point is, how to move and change a pivot point of an object, also like what you can sort of do with having pivot points in certain locations, say on like a door to make it rotate correctly, uh, and also just cover having pivots in certain locations for scaling things and saving yourself time. So what a pivot point is essentially the point in which any object is read. Uh, so right now you can see that the pivot point of this cube is right dot in the center, and in terms of its transforms or translates, uh, it's all sort of zeroed out because I've just made this object. So if I move my object, I get, you know, values in my translations, but they're being read from this point. But this point can be moved. So if I press D on my keyboard, I can move that pivot point freely. I can drag it around with all the handles. I can rotate it as well. Uh, but a lot of the time you'll want to actually snap this to something. So I can hold down V on my keyboard to snap the vertexes and snap the pivot point to that corner. And press D again to exit pivot point. When you press D, you'll see like you get this sort of little dot in the center of your manipulator, and that's how you sort of know that you're in pivot mode. You also get rotation handles as well as translates. So right now my object, even though I've moved this pivot point, it's still being read as 0, 0, 0. So right now its 0 location is based on it being in this exact spot. This can be really useful for snapping things. Say you had a lot of objects that sort of needed to line up, like a wall panel or some fencing or something like that. Um, I can put pivots in the corners of things and then snap them to each other. So if I copied this cube and move it just randomly somewhere, I can use this point to snap to this point and it'll be perfectly aligned. So clicking on the center here, so I move it in all three axes and holding in V, I can snap it to that point and you can see they're like perfectly aligned. Uh, Whereas if this pivot point was in the center and I was trying to line these up, you can see that it can be quite finicky. So if I need something to be sort of snapped exactly, or even just to get it close to something, I can manipulate the pivot point and uh, snap it exactly to that spot. And I'll save a lot of time, but it's also something that you'll do quite a lot while modeling. Uh, and because I've moved that pivot point there, it doesn't mean that it has to stay there, right? I can use that pivot point to get two objects lined up because I need them to be, but then I can reset it and start working on this object itself if I wanted to, based on the center again. So I mentioned the doors and like cupboards, levers, say lining stuff up in a radial pattern. These are all perfect examples of like where a pivot point can be utilized really well. So if I was to look at this door in isolate mode, I want to think about where this door would rotate from to open. Right, if its pivot point was in the center, the door rotates from the center, and that isn't how a door operates really. So I would want it to open from where the hinges connect, which would be in the bottom corner here. So if I look and snap it down, pressing D on my keyboard, holding V for vertex, and snapping it to that corner. Pressing D again to exit pivot mode. So now my door rotates around that point, and I can open and close it correctly. This can be really useful as well for scaling things and changing the size of things. If you think of this sofa, it's the right size that we want it now, but maybe down the line I want it to be a bit bigger. Right now it's pivots in the center, so if I wanted this to be bigger, I make it bigger, but now it's not aligned to the floor. Now I would have to come in and actually move it up to realign it with the floor. So if I had the pivot, I could move it down and have it scale from that point as well. So pivots will also not just in terms of rotation, it'll also scale from that point. So I could put this pivot point down here in the corner of this sofa and scale it, and it would always stay aligned with the floor. In terms of this sofa, when I scale it, it's actually scaling from this corner. So when I scale it, it's actually getting bigger in this direction, and if I made it smaller, it's getting shrunk into this point. So this isn't exactly ideal for this sofa. So I want this sofa to have its pivot in the center of the object, but aligned to the lowest point of it. So I go into isolate mode, I'm going to center its pivot again. I'm going to hit D on the keyboard. I'm going to click on this handle. So in Maya, when you're snapping things around, once this center point has a little yellow square around it, that means it's moving on all three axes. But if I want to snap something in a particular axis, in my case now Y, I can click on that axis and it will go yellow. Once it's yellow, it means I'm only operating in that axis. So now I can snap to this point, but it's only looking at the Y value of this point and snap into that. So when I press in on my mouse wheel and hover over this point, holding MV, it snaps down to the head of this point. I'm hitting D again to exit pivot mode, and now I've got pivot mode in the center of the sofa, and also it scales in both directions when I make it bigger or smaller, which is what I would want.